Hello and welcome to the People's Platform Special Edition. Our topic of discussion today is IMF in Sri Lanka beyond ticking boxes. Now, the first review of the $3 billion extended fund facility approved by the International Monetary Fund for Sri Lanka is currently taking place with an IMF staff team in Colombo. Given the enormity of the crises that the Sri Lankan people have had to endure over the past few years, how must Sri Lankans now brace themselves and equip themselves with the knowledge and skill set to help facilitate a process of inclusive and sustainable growth for the economy? Let's find out by speaking to three experts who now join us on Zoom. My first guest today is Dr. Shamini Kure. Dr. Kure is a member of the Presidential Advisory Group on Multilateral Engagement and Debt Sustainability, advising the government of Sri Lanka at present. Dr. Kure previously served in the IMF with a career spanning 35 years. Prior to her retirement in October 2021, Dr. Kure served as the director of the Institute of Capacity Development for 9 years. She was instrumental in establishing ICD, the IMF's Department for Capacity Building, and was key in providing strategic direction for the governance, management and funding of the IMF's capacity building activities, among a multitude of other key senior roles. Welcome, Dr. Kure. It's good to have you with us here.
Thank you, Sonali. It's a privilege to be here, and I'm very glad to participate in this discussion.
We are also joined by Professor Jayati Ghosh. Professor Ghosh is a professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts, USA. She has advised several Indian and other governments as well as international organizations. In March 2022, she was appointed to the UN Secretary General's High-Level Advisory Board on Effective Multilateralism, mandated to provide a vision for international cooperation to deal with current and future challenges. Among her many roles, she continues to engage with Sri Lanka, now as an advisory board member of the newly created Institute for Political Economy, Sri Lanka. Wonderful to have you here with us, Professor Ghosh.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here and on such an important issue.
My final guest is Mr. Murtaza Jafferji. Mr. Jafferji is the chair of Advocata Institute, an independent policy think tank based in Colombo. He's an investment professional with over 25 years of industry experience. He is also a chartered financial analyst, and he has previously been a director of the Colombo Stock Exchange. Welcome to the show, Mr. Jafferji.
Thank you, Sonali, for inviting me, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Absolutely. My first question is to Dr. Shamini Kure. Dr. Kure, over the past 2 years specifically, we've experienced the after effects of Sri Lanka's economy shrinking. People have had to shoulder massive tax burdens to appease for the sins of massive political and economic mismanagement. Poverty rates have gone up, there is food insecurity, heightened inflation, severe brain drain with professionals across industries leaving in their thousands. However, at present, we see that experts have been brought in, even though belatedly, to revive the economy. And the intellectual resources which were ignored thus far have entered the chat. So this is probably an oversimplification, but since not everyone is an economist, but interested in what is being done to the country, could you tell us if you see a sense of buoyancy in the way matters are progressing in Sri Lanka?
Thank you for the question, Sonali. So let me just say one thing I think we all agree on is that we need sustained inclusive growth. I think where we have some differences perhaps in view, include everywhere in Sri Lanka, is how to get there. Now, I would say that, your question on buoyancy, I would sort of characterize this period as some progress, much to be done. We've had some progress in the area of price stability. The inflation rate, which peaked above 70% in September last year, is now down to 4% in July and 2% in August. So there's a lot of progress. As you know, inflation hurts poor people much more than it hurts rich people. So there's progress there. There's also progress in terms of The tax structure, we got into this mess. The immediate reason that this economic crisis was caused by a tax cut that was essentially unsustainable, that cut off our access to international markets. So we have reversed those tax cuts, and there is a new tax structure in place, which in my view is broadly okay. And we still have to raise the tax revenue from a very low rate in 2021 of about 7.5% to as much as 14-15%. This is a long hill to climb. And so we're making some progress. Tax collections are increasing, but here's the catch. The economy is extremely weak. And the buoyancy you spoke of, the economy shrank by 11% in the first quarter. It's recovering slowly. I want to make sure that people understand something, because this is something that I think is what I call conflation or proximity confusion, which is that people blame the adjustment policies for the economic contraction. The reality is that the contraction is mainly caused by the fact that you had very high inflation as recently as in September 22. We have plenty of international evidence to show that when inflation rates reach that kind of height, when a country is deprived of external inflows, the economy does tank. I have worked in many adjustment programs, and similar things happen. So it's not great, but let's be clear where the blame lies. It lies in the initial unsustainable profligate policies. And then the economy contracts, and an adjustment program takes place almost simultaneously, and people blame the adjustment program. So I just want to be clear that while we can have differences in view on who should bear the burden of the adjustment, I think we all agree it shouldn't be the poor, it has to be the rich, and it's a question of how you calibrate those policies. But the real culprit in all of this is what happened before 22. So I want to be very clear that the lack of buoyancy that I'm talking about comes as an after effect of what happened in our previous policies. Now, can policies be better? Absolutely. I think we will talk about these ways in which policies could be better. I, for one, would like to see more taxation of the very rich and the very wealthy. I don't think they're being taxed enough. I would like to see more serious efforts at tax collection, getting rid of tax exemptions. There are plenty of things the government can do now that it needs to do, and I hope they will focus on that. And then there are areas in improving our public spending. This would, the state enterprises are mismanaged. They need to be, we need to shift from giving subsidies to state enterprises. There's a lot of improvement possible on procurement. These inefficiencies and, frankly, not good governance needs to be addressed so that we can spend more on health, on education, and social transfer. So that's the second point. And a third one is we need to have more open trade policies. Our trade is thoroughly protected, and it protects very rich businessmen who have privileged access to trade monopolies, essentially to monopolies. So we need to be an export-oriented, private sector-driven economy, because the government can no longer afford to be the driver of growth. It has to be the private sector. The government is heavily indebted. We are all paying the price for that. So I just want to say the buoyancy is going to come from private sector growth, from export-oriented growth, and not from these sort of privileged monopolies that we've seen. So I think this is where our efforts really need to be. So it would be my quick overview of where I think we've made progress, but there's more progress to be made. And one other thing I want to be very clear, we need to protect the vulnerable and the poor, who right now there's a Asvasuma program to do direct cash transfers, and they need to increase that program. We need to register more people, estate workers, plantation workers. There are daily wage laborers. There are people who don't even enter the labor force for various reasons. These people have to be protected. So we have to put more effort into the distributional consequences of the growth path and the adjustment path. So that would be how I would summarize where we need to focus.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that very comprehensive overview, Dr. Kure. My next question is to Professor Ghosh. Professor, you've advised several governments. Speak to us about this trust deficit that Sri Lankans have with the government. And this has been the case with successive governments, not just the prevailing government, where the government is meant to hold power and authority in trust for the people. However, time and time again, across decades, people have mostly been at the brunt of governmental mismanagement and political thuggery and manipulation. So without the citizenry having faith in the government to take them out of these multitude of crises that we're currently in, what do we do? How does one go about bridging that gap? Because that is so important.
Yes, that's a very good question. And I think, Sharmini has already given an excellent overview of the current situation. I want to pick up on the last point she made, which I think is absolutely critical. It's the distributional consequences of both adjustment and the presumed strategy of growth. I think there's no dispute that there has to be an adjustment. I mean, obviously, right? You can't run these incredible deficits internally and externally, which have not benefited the ordinary people very much. In fact, these deficits over the last decade in particular. But the pattern of adjustment is absolutely critical because that also has huge distributional implications. And I think that relates directly to the trust deficit that you're talking about. When people feel that the policy choices of the government are such as to put an additional burden on them and yet allow those who benefited from the previous growth really not to pay too much of a cost or often to gain from this process, then obviously there is a trust deficit. So I think it's really very important to unpick the distribution elements of this particular adjustment strategy. And here I really would like to question the way in which this has been done. Yes, inflation, absolutely right, Sharmini, dramatically affects the poor, and the poor are the worst off in these extreme inflationary conditions. But that's one part of their problem. The second part of it is, do they get a livelihood? Can they earn anything? Are their pensions worth anything? And so on and so forth. So it's not just the fact of what money income you receive, how much it's worth, but whether you're going to be able to receive a money income. And that's where a major part of the adjustment problem, I believe, has been really against the interests of the Sri Lankan working class, peasantry, small enterprises, and so on. Very high interest rates, you could say that was necessary to control inflation, but across the world, there is growing consensus that the interest rate is just one tool, and often a heavy-handed tool, especially when you have monopolies and oligopolies able to take advantage of particular situations of uncertainty to create what my colleague Isabella Weber calls seller's inflation, which we find is prevalent across the world, including in Sri Lanka. So there are different ways of controlling seller's inflation. And it's a very heavy and blunt tool to adopt an interest rate policy, which also attacks micro and small enterprises, attacks farmers, and therefore the people who work for those enterprises. So it attacks livelihoods in a very basic sense. That's one problem. The second problem is, yes, the tax revenues, there is some reform. It's certainly inadequate, mainly because even the projected increases in tax revenue are dominantly regressive. More than half of the additional tax revenues are going to come from indirect taxes, which disproportionately affect the poor. Then you have the freeing of energy prices, which in turn impacts every other price, but also it impacts on transport and all the basic needs of people, which again has a very regressive impact on the poor. And then you have what I find, frankly, the most obscene of the most recent developments is the decision to insist on a domestic debt haircut along with the external debt haircut. Now, frankly, this is really absolutely not required because countries can repay their domestic debt. They're in a position to print money and generate the repayments. There's a problem repaying external debt. And that's really the source of Sri Lanka's debt problem, is that it wasn't generating the foreign exchange required to repay its external debt. From about 2016, at least, I think it was doing a form of Ponzi finance, borrowing from private sources to repay the international financial institutions. The repayment of foreign exchange debt is the critical problem here. And to insist on a kind of joint haircut, which reduces the haircut on global private creditors, many of whom, because of the very high risk premium they were getting, they've already actually been repaid in full. But to insist that the debt haircut has to fall on both external and private is deeply unfair, because who does it impact? You're not doing it on the banking system because the banking system is too fragile and will not bear that burden. It will collapse. So you're doing it on the pension schemes. To me, that is a travesty. You are attacking the hard-earned and compulsory savings of the poor in the form of these retirement funds, and doing what will effectively amount, I think the estimate is a 30% decline over 10 years. You're reducing the payout to those by 0.5% of GDP every year for the poorest people, for the garment workers, for the plantation workers, for all of the ethnic minority workers across, the ones that Sharmini said we really have to do something for. You're attacking their savings. And mind you, these were not voluntary savings that they put into these schemes. This is compulsory extraction from their salaries every month. And you're attacking the poorest of the poor in these kinds of situations. Why would you want to do this kind of strategy? I think, it's not surprising then that there is a trust deficit. When you're saying that what this does, in effect, is reduce the haircut required of the foreign creditors because of the way the IMF has designed this particular debt sustainability argument. And in that context, when the IMF says, yes, 3% growth per year and so on, and we know the economy is currently continuing to decline, and when it's unlikely to decline unless you can generate some demand somewhere. So private sector will not respond unless you generate some domestic demand. There is a limit to which you can squeeze the incomes of working people and peasants and micro enterprises, and then expect that there will be a revival in the economy. There's only so much you can do with export-led growth in a global economy where every single country in the world is desperately trying to raise its export revenues, often in very similar commodities. So I believe it's the strategy of adjustment which has deeply adverse distributional consequences, which is ultimately one of the major factors behind the trust deficit. I mean, if I were a working person in Sri Lanka, I wouldn't have much trust either. And I think that's the source of the problem.
Thank you for that, Professor Ghosh. Mr. Jafferji, sobering remarks by Professor Ghosh. Could you weigh in on the fact that we need an equitable taxation policy, given that we're in the middle of an IMF-supported program, given the fact that debt restructuring must take place, also given that there are protests protesting against the Employee Provident Fund being used in this whole endeavor?
So let me try to address that. And even because I have the benefit of being on the ground and looking at these numbers on a day-to-day basis, so I perhaps have a better understanding of the nuances. Let's see what was proposed. I mean, the whole debt sustainability analysis was based that our public debt was 128% of GDP. And even after debt restructuring, it would be 95% of GDP in about 10 years' time. Now, there is no red line, but it is generally expected that a market access country like Sri Lanka should not have a public debt to GDP above 70%. So even after 10 years, the level of debt that we are carrying is extremely high. And the amount of debt that we carry basically will also have a very high interest rate. As I said, something like 8% of GDP which is very, very high. And therefore, there needed to be a reduction in interest rates. 75% of the cost of interest rates is coming from domestic interest rates, and only 25% is coming from the external debt. So, as they have demonstrated that there had to be domestic debt restructuring, because what economists call the gross financing needs, which means that the amount of debt that is coming due every year that needs to be rolled over, had to be brought down to something like 13% of GDP. And if I recollect that this year it was forecasted to be as high as 38% of GDP, which is extremely high. The reason why we had a very short-term debt was that during the COVID years, we started issuing very short dated securities. And therefore, the mix of long-dated to short-dated securities in the domestic debt got more skewed to short-dated, and therefore we had a bunching up problem. So one of the objectives of the domestic debt restructuring was to stretch most of the short-term debt to a longer period of time. The majority of the short-term debt, which is in the form of treasury bills, so when they did the debt restructuring around the end of June, when they announced it, there was about 5.3 trillion of treasury bills and about 9 trillion of treasury bonds, and a very small amount like 270 billion in local currency of dollar denominated debt called Sri Lanka development bonds. Out of the treasury bills, 50% was owned by the central bank. And I believe that a few days ago, the swap went through, where most of that debt will be pushed back and settled over 15 years. Some of it is more short term, which will get settled in the next 12 months in the form of treasury bills. The treasury bonds was what most of these long-term savings institutions were holding. 43% was being held by the superannuation funds. 33% of that 43% was by the provident fund. So what was suggested was that, and the only way you can look at this, there were lots of analysts giving analysis of what it costs the pension holders. But the only way to analyze this from a finance perspective is to look at the mark-to-market loss on day one. And we did our analysis because the Provident Fund does not divulge what they are holding. And my estimate was a loss of 5 to 6%. The minister, the MP who is in charge of the Committee on Public Finance, Dr. Harsha De Silva, tweeted that he was given the actual figures and that it was in the order of 4%. So I want to outrightly say that what the pension holders got was not too bad a deal, because they don't have a cash flow problem because the inflows far exceed the outflows. So it was just mainly an adjustment of the maturity profile. And they were offered bonds with an average yield of about 10.2%. So they were step down bonds starting from 12%, and after 2 years, the coupon would go down to 9%. And for each bond that they exchanged, they got 12 bonds. So the way these mark-to-market losses work is that if you have any bonds basically that have yields above the 10.2% and you swap it, then you are going to lose. If you had bonds that had yields below that 10.2%, you would gain. So what happened in the EPF's case, why the loss is only 4%, is that if you look at all the bonds outstanding in Sri Lanka, prior to 2022, most bonds were issued around 10% yields. So if you swap them for 10.3%, you're pretty much equal. You won't make much of it. But I call the period starting from January 2022 the crisis period. And I call the bonds that were issued crisis bonds. So out of the 9 trillion, 1.9 trillion were crisis bonds, which were issued at more than 10%. More than 20%, yields of more than 20%. So if you swap those bonds basically for bonds that are yielding 10.2%, and especially the longer duration because they're more valuable because you are assured a higher rate of interest over a long period of time, the losses are more. Now, although the Provident Fund is supposed to have 43%, or the superannuation funds have 43% of total bonds outstanding, the superannuation funds do not hold 43% of these highly yielding crisis bonds, right? And these crisis bonds basically are the ones that are going to impose a very high burden on the government in terms of interest payments because they are yielding a large amount of interest. So I feel they made a mistake basically in not widening the exchange perimeter because you did not get relief on 43% of the crisis bonds. My estimate is the relief was only about 25%. Then there is a huge question of equity, and I do agree with Dr. Ghosh that you basically the way the provident funds work in Sri Lanka is that they don't have representation. It's managed by the monetary board. So the members of the fund did not have any say on whether to accept it or not. The monetary board, which is also in charge of the public debt office, is also acting on behalf of the EPF, which is the largest superannuation fund. And we all know that they are terribly conflicted, that these two functions, which are called agency functions of the central bank, should never be with the bank. And I believe in the IMF program that they have to take out the public debt office to an independent public debt office under the treasury. But it's silent with regard to the Provident Fund. I believe that the Provident Fund also should be taken out and put in an independent authority. So the problem here that I have is that you excluded everybody else. And one argument was that you don't want to include the banks because you'd have a banking crisis. So out of the 9 trillion, 4 trillion was held by the banks, of which 3 trillion was held by state banks that are owned by the government. So if you restructure them, then again, it's the government who will get the loss. But then some of the banks who were holding very high proportion of these crisis bonds made a killing, which means that the benefit went to the shareholders. There were also individuals who I estimate hold about 5% of these crisis bonds, who probably made capital gains between 50 and 100%. So there is a fundamental problem, Sonali, of fairness. And one of the things is I said IMF came here because we invited them to come here. And they are the only game in town that they need. We need them. This is the 17th time we had the program. But I have serious concerns and a lot of anger in me that the adjustment program is not equitable. I explained to you about the case of the domestic debt restructuring, that it should have been widened and many more other people should have been taken into the net. There is also an issue with the taxation, that there is a problem with the policy because we continue to have tax holidays being given. Some large infrastructure projects like the West Terminal were given a 20-year tax holiday. Today's Sunday Times paper talks about the investment minister asking for 2-year tax holidays for IT companies. There are a large number of companies who are having tax concessions coming from as long as 20 years ago, where they have a concessionary tax rate without sunset clauses. If you are a person who is in a profession whose services are delivered outside Sri Lanka, you have zero tax rate. If you are the same person delivering your services in Sri Lanka, the marginal tax rate is 36%. So I have never seen any policy papers, etc., justifying basically these exemptions. So I have serious reservations about the loopholes that have been kept in the tax policy without any justifiable reason. And then we have a huge problem of tax administration, that there is a large number of people who are in the high income groups who are not paying their fair share of taxes.
Thank you very much. We go in for a short commercial break. We'll be right back. Welcome back. You're with the People's Platform Special Edition. We're in conversation with Professor Jayati Ghosh, Dr. Shamini Kure and Mr. Murtaza Jafferji. After the break, my first question is to Dr. Shamini Kure. Dr. Shamini Kure, time and time again, you have spoken about the importance of ensuring that there is equitability in taxation policy so that the rich don't go scot-free, and also that we don't look at haphazard tax exemptions and tax holidays for corporations. Speak to us about how dangerous this is for the economic recovery process.
Thank you. Yes, I totally agree with Murtaza on this point on tax holidays. I've been speaking against this for a long time. Now, how does this affect us? We have an extremely low tax ratio. We've agreed on this. We have also refused to or have had to restructure our obligations, which the government promised to pay the creditors, and they have taken them restructuring, both domestic and external. Now, tell me, why are corporations exempt from any reduction in the tax privileges they've been given? Let me explain. A tax exemption is exactly the same thing as giving a subsidy to a corporation, an outright cash, because what it should have paid is essentially returned to it via tax exemption. So the only purpose of a tax exemption is, frankly, not to be transparent. Because if you really want to privilege some industry because you think it serves a development purpose, then give it a subsidy where everybody can see who is getting it and how much it's worth. So I would say that given the need for us to increase taxes as a proportion of our GDP in order to pay past debt primarily, but also to support a decent amount of social services, we should sunset the existing tax holidays. I know people say, oh, but goodness me, how can we do that? Well, you just reneged on the debt. So why don't you sunset some of these tax privileges? Go on for years, 14, 15, 20 years. So there is no reason. I mean, if you have to give a subsidy, give it for a year. But I would say, why do you need a subsidy in the first place? And let's be clear. A subsidy to a corporation goes to the owners of that corporation, and those owners are rich. So that's why I think even existing tax holidays need to be shortened, sunsetted to expire within 2 years or 3 years, the existing ones. Now, Port City, under the guise of strategic development projects, which there's no definition of what's strategic, so it's completely up to politicians to grant these things. We're giving exemption from VAT, from personal income taxes, from corporate income taxes. It's every conceivable tax. Now, tell me, as you know, Murtaza was saying, what is the rationale? There is, and the usual thing is, oh, but we have to attract private investment from abroad. Well, why would you want to attract private investment that pays absolutely no taxes? That's number one. Number two, why do you build a project in which you cannot get reasonably profitable companies to come? And the way to deal with a non-profitable project is not to create more distortions. It is to address the problem as is. And I would say, if you want to keep Port City, just make sure you collect the taxes from these entities that are going to invest there. That's the whole point. Otherwise, how does Port City justify itself? So, and there are going to be tremendous expenditures on the part of the government to have to provide transport, electricity, a number of public services that the government has to provide. And by the way, the Port City was approved by legislation during the last government. It's relatively new, so it can be changed. And I would say have a revised Port City bill that takes away all these privileges and basically creates a new way of thinking about it as a place that attracts tax revenues for us through growth. So it could be entertainment, it could be other things, tourism, but it should not be this kind of exemption. You know that a lot of companies are going to simply go and relocate there. What would have relocated and paid taxes within Sri Lanka, the rest of Sri Lanka will go and relocate there, and their directors and their executives will be potentially exempt from personal income taxes. Now, that is unfair. So I absolutely agree that we have to get rid of these tax exemptions. And the prognosis for us, if we don't increase our tax ratio to 15%, is pretty bad. As Murtaza said, we have a very high debt ratio even after the restructuring. And so it's a narrow path. And if we don't get to the kind of ratio that we need, which is, in my view, more like 15, 16% of GDP, then we will end back again with a restructuring. And that restructuring will be far more painful than the one we've just experienced. And the impact on the poor will be far greater. So it is absolutely urgent that we address these exemptions and collect taxes properly from people who are actually amongst the very wealthy and are not in the tax books. There are no tax files on them. So the IRD needs to be resourced properly to be able to do this, including creating a large taxpayer unit, which the government has for many years, different governments for many years has avoided doing, even though the IMF has consistently suggested it. So yes, there's a lot more to be done there.
All right, thank you very much. Professor Ghosh, in order to ensure that we don't have any more missteps in governance or malgovernance, we need to have an attitudinal shift and break out of this beholden unto politicians culture that Sri Lankans have so much of, this political patronage culture, which is very much a cancer that has seeped into every nook and cranny of Sri Lanka's psyche. How do you propose this could be done?
I think it's very clear who has benefited from the recent policies of the past decade. And yes, there's definitely a culture of patronage, clientelism, etc., among the elites who have benefited. No question about it. That definitely has to be attacked. I think, both Dr. Jafferji and Sharmini have made excellent points about the tax holidays and the different kinds of tax so-called incentives that are being given. And I couldn't agree more. I think that's absolutely essential. But, I want to go back to this issue that Dr. Jafferji raised about the debt, because I think it's a little important. There is no level of public debt that is necessarily a problem. The rich countries as a group, the average public debt to GDP ratio today is about 112% of GDP. There are countries like Japan that have 263% of GDP. Why is it not a problem for them? Because they issue it in their own currency. Across the world, the countries that are issuing debt predominantly in their own currency, that's not a problem. The problem is really when you have to generate foreign exchange that you're unable to generate. And so you end up in this Ponzi borrowing, which too many developing countries are on track of, but that Sri Lanka has been doing for a while. And so you have to address that problem. That is definitely where a debt reduction is also clearly required. But if you do say, and here I also completely agree with you, that if you do want to reduce the domestic public debt, you have to do that equitably. You can't simply say, well, if the burden is going to fall on pension funds, and I repeat, this was compulsory savings. And the decision to do this was also absolutely not under the control of those who have paid into those pension funds. Unlike all the private creditors who get a say in their haircut, here is a situation where the clear conflict of interest of the Monetary Board in terms of reducing the public debt encourages them to go in for what to me is an absolutely unjustifiable reduction in the hard-earned savings of the poor people. Now, if in fact the government really wants to protect the incomes of the poor, then let them recapitalize the pension funds. Let them actually put some money where their mouth is in terms of protecting the poor and so on. Because a little bit of cash handouts today to people is not going to be enough to compensate for something like a 30% loss of retirement incomes over a decade. I think that's something absolutely important and essential. But, since we're in this thing of questioning, let me throw something else out there, which I'm sure is likely to create a bit of controversy with both of you. I'm actually wondering, now this is, I admit, a view from the outside, how beneficial is this IMF agreement for the Sri Lankan economy? So let's just see, what does it consist of? It's 3 billion over 4 years. That is what, less than 3% of your projected import bill in terms of the annual payments. It's less than 1/5 of your debt servicing requirements. over the next 3 years, the time that you'll be getting this money, the next 4 years when you'll be getting this money. So you're not getting very much in terms of the dollar receipts, okay? You could actually try and save that much money through specific controls on, like, let's say, luxury imports, or trying to generate more foreign exchange through different routes. So the purely quantitative impact of this IMF loan is not that much. You are also going to be paying interest on this. So let's not forget, the IMF loans are no longer cheap because market rates have gone up, because the combined minimum SDR rate is now in the range of 5%. I'm sure Sri Lanka will have to pay surcharges because of these ridiculous IMF rules on surcharges. You're probably already paying surcharges on your, because if you have been running a program for a certain length of time, you are automatically subject to surcharges. We need to know. I don't think there is clarity on exactly how much is the repayment on the IMF loan, but it cannot be below 5.05%, which is the base SDR rate at the moment, and it's likely to be much more. So it's not money coming cheaply. Let's contrast this with other ways in which you could have tried to get this money. And are you saying, okay, well, we need the IMF loan to generate investor confidence? There are so many cases of countries that have managed to revive investor confidence without IMF loans. There are cases of other countries that have recently signed deals. I'm thinking now of Zambia, which has signed a debt restructuring deal, which managed to successfully resist the attempt to include domestic debt restructuring. It actually has refused to get domestic debt restructuring into that contract. So I'm wondering whether the Sri Lankan government really did the best possible decision in terms of saying, the IMF loan or else. Because if it's going to put you on a trajectory of declining growth, if it's going to put you on a trajectory of dramatic deterioration in the living conditions of the bulk of the population, that also generates more political instability. That also generates more social tensions. Is it actually good for the country? I'm just putting it out there.
Mr. Jafferjee, would you like to respond?
Can I just ask a quick question from Jayati?
Sure.
What exactly do you have in mind other than the IMF to finance the government, given that capital markets have cut us off, given that no other IFI, that is a World Bank, Asian Development Bank, will finance us? Where exactly would we get that financing? It would be helpful to understand that.
No, so what are you thinking of? You're thinking of about 3% of your import bill over 4 years.
No, the IMF program, Jayati, I want to be very clear. IMF program is a catalyst. The point of the IMF is not to provide a huge amount of balance of payments financing. As you yourself say, it's not a good idea to borrow lots of money from the IMF. And by the way, exceptional financing is where the surcharges come from, and we do not have exceptional financing. So it should be the standard SDR charge, which you say is around 5%. But my question is this. The IMF should never be seen as the sole source of balance of payments financing. It is a catalyst for others to come in. And by design, the international financial architecture is such that without an IMF program, you cannot have a debt restructuring, right? So we would have been, without the IMF, in the position of having defaulted and having zero access to any kind of external financing, and the adjustment would have been a lot harsher. So the counterfactual is not some wonderful thing where we would have just managed on our own. The counterfactual is we would have been cut off even more, and it would have been more painful. So we are right now getting financing from IFIs, from the World Bank, Asian Development Bank. They are disbursing to us. Private money is trickling in, but at the moment, let's keep that aside. It's not very much. So I just want to be clear, and that we understand what the alternatives are before we sort of say, well, why do we need this?
Yes, I would like to actually take that up very much, because, I think this whole notion that without the IMF, you're never going to get access. No, I agree. With the default, you need to do something about the default. You have to restructure the debt. And there are countries, Argentina in the 2000s, etc., that restructured without the IMF. Okay.
And look where Argentina is now.
That's very different. I'm sorry. They got into trouble when they went back after doing a wrong deal. So that was with President Macri with the IMF. Argentina's current problems date to the IMF under President Macri. They were doing quite well before that. In fact, for 15 years, they did actually very well. We can have a different discussion on Argentina, but in fact, for 15 years after their debt restructuring in 2003,
So why did they go back?
Because of Mr. Macri. And that's politics. Why did the Rajapakshas do what they did? So let's not go there, Sharmini. That's a very, and why did the IMF give that loan? Very problematic as well, right? Lots of things out there. Let's not go into that one. What I'm really saying is that it doesn't follow. What is the catalyst for private funders to come back? It is domestic economic recovery. That's the catalyst. And that is shown over and over again. Is the IMF either a necessary or a sufficient condition for domestic economic recovery? No. We have seen that also over and over again. So I think the real issue is not if not the IMF, then it's disaster and all hell breaks loose and with the apocalypse and so on. No. The disaster to me, frankly, is the lack of imagination in thinking that there is no option but the IMF and we have to take whatever conditions come with it, even if we feel that that is going to lead us into further economic depression over the next few years. I think that is the real unfortunate thing here.
Mr. Jafferji,
you asked me a question which I couldn't answer as yet. So I'm going to say certain things that I said before because certain things are worth repeating again. The IMF is the only game in town for Sri Lanka. By delaying the IMF program, the level of the crisis was accentuated. This is the 17th time the IMF is in Sri Lanka. It's no stranger to us. The focus of the IMF program is on macro stabilization. There is a monitoring mission in town, and I had the opportunity to meet them along with other civil society and other think tanks. Some of the others, the comments that were voiced by some of the others expect the IMF to solve all the problems of Sri Lanka. I think that is a bit unrealistic that, if you have a problem with the nature of the state, you need other mechanisms to fix those issues. The IMF can only fix the issues on macro stabilization, and the program is designed mainly for macro stabilization, which is to make sure that the economy is sustainable, the inflation is down, that the current account is manageable, etc. So coming back to this response about the debt, there are three criteria to make a debt sustainable: the absolute or the amount of debt relative to the size of your economy, that's your debt to GDP. Then there is the amount of interest relative to the size of your economy, and what's called the gross financing needs, which says that the profile of your debt, whether it's short-term or long-term. In terms of our total debt, the domestic debt restructuring did not entail a principal haircut. So the amount of debt outstanding was not cut. In terms of the interest rate, most of the interest rates, it was explained that 1.5% relief we got because it was expected that our interest to GDP was going to be 8%. 1.5% was going to come through domestic debt restructuring. 1% came from the central bank because the central bank is holding 2.6 trillion worth of treasury bills plus about 500 billion in provisional advances, almost 3 trillion, which is issued in the short term. Treasury bills cannot be more than 12 months and they've been issued at very, very high interest rates, which anyway, now that inflation has come down to single digit levels and policy rates would be reduced, that interest rate would have come down anyway. But the central bank by law under the old Monetary Law Act could only invest in treasury bills in the primary auction. So that was reprofiled over the last bit will come out in 15 years time. So that was going to significantly impact the gross financing needs. The other thing that Dr. Ghosh might not know, that 1 week ago, there was a new central bank law that was signed by the speaker and has come into force. There is a new institution that is now in operation, including new appointments to the governing board. The law explicitly prohibits monetary financing. The initial draft had a very hard stop, but the Supreme Court intervened and asked for certain exemptions under exceptional circumstances. And those exceptional circumstances are if there is a natural disaster or pandemic, And it's very tight conditions that even if they do monetary financing, it will only be for a very short period of time. So over the last so many years since independence, over 75 years, the central bank has been an agent of the government who has assisted in financing these very large deficits. That is no more, which means a very easy source of financing is no more. So if you're going to run large deficits, you either have to tax or you have to borrow from the markets. And if you start borrowing from the markets, the real rates of interest are going to go up, and basically the economy is going to slow down. So, as I said, that the domestic debt restructuring, which was of the 9 trillion, there was some relief that came, which was 0.5% of GDP. Remember, the central bank was 1% on the interest bill. It should have been more if more of those crisis bonds were restructured, because they are the ones that have been issued at 20%, some of them 30%. There's even one bond that was issued at 30% yield for 10 years, basically. And the people holding on to those bonds, it was issued in 1st July 2022. If they continue to hold it today, my estimate is they made a return of 130%. And if you are an individual, the capital gains was something like 110%. And the tax on capital gains is only 10%. So you only paid 10% and you kept 90% for yourself. When I have a serious issue of people profiteering from a crisis, they should have restructured that, because out of the total interest payments of the total stock of bonds, the crisis bonds account for about 40% of the interest. So there could have been a significant amount of interest relief if we widen the perimeter. But I'm not the person who decided. There may have been reasons why they did it. Certainly in the case of bonds, I think there could have been regulatory forbearance, even though they would have had to take a mark-to-market loss, that they would have recovered it because interest rates would have come down. You see, the banking is a net interest margin game. And if the deposit interest rates came down and if their bonds were restructured, they would have yet earned a positive net interest margin. Because at the moment, basically, the interest rates are coming down. The deposit interest rates, I'm projecting by the end of the year, will probably come down to about 6 to 7%. So if you were given a bond that had a yield of about 10.2%, you will still earn a net interest margin of about 4%. You would have been able to manage it. Now, another thing that I would disagree with Dr. Ghosh about why we needed the IMF is because my day job is in the capital markets. The capital markets is all based on expectations. And the main driver of access to international markets is your rating. Now, your rating agency basically is going to look at, they have much greater comfort if there is an IMF program, because it's an extra monitoring and it is putting a country into a more sustainable path. So the confidence, because it's all about rolling over the debt, right? No country ever pays back its debt. So what happened to us in 2020 is the moment that our rating was cut, the ability for us to roll over debt was no more, and it was foolish to continue to start servicing the debt with our meager foreign exchange resources, which aggravated the problem. And then the Sri Lankan population significantly suffered, including 30% of the population that is today in poverty. So this is what I'm trying to say, that we have to play by the rules of the international monetary system. The markets give you money as long as you play by the rules of the market. It's not, there is an expectation that there is a certain probability of default, and that was getting baked into the thing. So there has to be some kind of restructuring, because a lot of people who are owning our commercial debt, which is about 12.5 billion in the form of Euro bonds, have probably not bought it at 100, they bought it at discounted values. But these are the rules of the market, and we should follow the rules of the market. So that's kind of my summation of my viewpoint on this whole debt issue.
I take many of Mr. Jaffarji's points. I think that it's absolutely true that you have to look at the markets. I just looked up what the credit rating of Sri Lanka is. It's been downgraded twice in the last year by 2 of the major companies. It's all in the B territory for all 4 of them. And the outlook is negative for 2 out of the 4 and stable but very low for the other 2. So it's not as if the IMF loan did a lot, right? It was downgraded twice already this year, despite the IMF loan. However,
that is the domestic debt. That rating is applying to the domestic debt. That's not the external debt. We are in what is called selective default.
So there we go. You see, once again, there is a distinction to be made between domestic and external debt. And I think that's really the critical point here that we're talking about. And so it's not only about the domestic debt, it's particularly about the external debt. So that's number one. But the other thing that it's very interesting when I hear so many Sri Lankan economists say that we've been to the IMF 17 times, we're no stranger. Doesn't that suggest something? That you've gone to the IMF 17 times, you're practically never out of an IMF program, and yet each time you think the IMF is going to come and solve it and somehow become the catalyst for future growth. And I'm not blaming the IMF. No, I'm saying that there is some peculiarity in this particular dynamic in which you keep going back to the IMF saying, this time will be different. This time we're going to catalyze global investment. This time we're going to get growth because we're going to do one more of the reforms we haven't yet done, which impact on the working people. So I'm a little surprised at this continual faith that, somehow there's an agreement with the IMF, even if we can see that the immediate and let's say 3-year impact of it is going to be negative from the point of view of economic activity, employment, livelihoods, micro enterprises, workers' pensions, etc. Despite all that, somehow it's going to generate dynamism and growth in the economy. When we've done this 17 times over, but yeah, this time is going to be different. I do find that a little odd. And I believe that the countries that are successful in these IMF programs are not the ones who have to keep going back, right? Otherwise, you don't call them successful. The ones who go back are what? Pakistan is another case that has been back continuously. The Philippines for a very long period, except that now it is seen as a country that doesn't have to go back to the IMF. But for about 30 years, it was always with the IMF. Now, I'm saying that therefore, I'm really saying, why is there no imagination beyond the IMF? And that to me is a surprise. And especially when there are alternatives being suggested, as far as I can see, by the trade unions, by women's organizations, by a group of people who are directly affected by these. They are suggesting alternatives. These are just completely excluded. We can't even consider those. The IMF is the only game in town. We have to do this, and we have to do it in the following way, even though it is deeply unfair and unjust to working people. And in fact, it's also unfair by most criteria that you are discriminating against a particular set of bondholders.
Dr. Shamini, would you have a response?
Yes. Let me step back. I would agree that there is a difference between external and domestic debt, but that doesn't mean that domestic debt is a free good. Jati, you mentioned that you could do a number of things. Well, the only thing you can do is you mentioned print money. Well, printing money is the same thing as inflation, basically. And we found out the money supply increased by 40%, and our inflation rate rose the next year after a few months. So that is a tax on poor people. If you issue too much domestic debt, the only way you can get out of it is either through taxation or an inflation tax or a debt restructuring. Those are the only 3 options available. So the issue, the fundamental issue is that Sri Lankans refuse to have a sustainable fiscal position. You asked why 17 times? I totally agree. The IMF is a lender of last resort. Why do we keep going to the lender of last resort 17 times? It's because we have a huge governance problem, which is our problem to solve. It is not the IMF's problem. Just as much as Argentina has a governance problem, we have an enormous governance problem. There's a lot of corruption. There's official mismanagement of official resources. That we are just, a lot of problems. And that's what sends us, and a refusal to tax wealthy people. So indeed, we have to fix those things. I would not dispute that. And the IMF would love for us to fix those things. They do not want to come in 17 times, but they are obliged by their mandate to help their members when the member requests to help. So, and frankly, to confuse the IMF with causing the problems is like having a patient come to the emergency room.
I have to. No, I'm sorry. Both of you are setting. I have at no point did I say the IMF caused the problem. You're both setting up a straw person. Please stop doing this.
Then if the IMF didn't cause the problem,
I have not said. So please don't do this.
Fine. I will take that back.
It's very easy to just criticize a non-position.
Okay, let me just take it back. I think what you're saying is that there are other alternatives to going to the IMF. And you said there are countries that didn't go to the IMF. Zambia is under an IMF program. The only reason it doesn't have a debt
I said
restructuring.
Zambia managed to avoid domestic debt restructuring.
Okay, but let's be clear, it's under IMF program.
Let's try and
I'm just saying.
Without kind of construing what people are saying.
I'm not. I'm simply making a statement.
I think you are.
Yeah, no. I'm making a statement. Zambia is under an IMF program. The reason its domestic debt is not in the restructuring is Zambia's banking system is 1/4 the size of Sri Lanka's. It has not much significant domestic debt. So it doesn't make a big difference to the fiscal profile. So you can't really compare it with Sri Lanka. That's something to keep in mind. And also it has access to concessional resources, external resources, which Sri Lanka does not have. So the situation is a little bit different. So what I would say is that I would like to understand what specifically these alternatives are. I think from my point of view, the fundamental problem we have to address is to keep our tax ratios at about, in my view, around 18% of GDP, 17, 18%, tax the wealthier people and not give all these tax exemptions, manage our spending so that we don't have so much bad governance and corruption in the management of fiscal resources, which has been going on for years, and therefore have more social protection, health, education, more spending on things that the government should be doing. So I would say, the issue for me is about our own good governance, which I think is fundamentally the problem. And it's not about, once we've got into trouble, well, the alternatives aren't great. I would agree. Every time a country gets into a crisis, the alternatives just aren't very good. We should not get into crises. And I also want to be clear, Malaysia, you mentioned. So I worked on the East Asia crisis cases. Malaysia's growth outcomes and inflation outcomes are very similar to the countries that did go to the IMF. So in the end, it did without an IMF program, credit to them. But they also did not get any better growth and inflation profile than the countries that did. So it's, I'm not saying the IMF is a panacea. In fact, it would be great if countries didn't go to the IMF. It's a sign of success. So I think our challenge is to ensure that we run our public finances in a sustainable and accountable and transparent way. So I think we can agree is really the fundamental problem, which we as Sri Lankans have to take care of.
All right. Thank you very much. I think I'd like to shift gears at this stage because we have several other areas to cover. Mr. Jaffery, austerity measures cannot be at the cost of the most vulnerable. We do know that the Aswasuma program has been initiated. However, this doesn't take away from the fact that poverty is very much an issue in Sri Lanka, and there are those who fall outside these social protection nets.
Let me respond to that, right? Now, the vulnerable, the poverty rate has risen to 30% of the population. And there's a serious issue about nutrition also. Now, when we say that the adjustment is making more of the population vulnerable, let's see where the biggest adjustments happen. The biggest adjustments happen in utilities and energy. And the World Bank has shown in Sri Lanka that any kind of subsidy, mainly in the form of a tax subsidy, in the case of electricity, they were selling it below cost, 70% of the benefit flow into the top 30% of households. So just to give you one of the most energy intensive utensils in a particular house is air conditioning. And if I'm not mistaken, only 5% of Sri Lankan homes have air conditioning. So when you don't revise electricity prices for 10 years, the question is who's benefiting from that? So they had to revise because the electricity utility was totally unviable, and the electricity prices did significantly go up. But recently they have adjusted it so that there's a lifeline rate that if you consume less than 30 units or if you consume less than 60 units, your tariff rate is probably about 1/5 of the rate I pay. So I probably pay like 75 rupees, and those lifeline rates pay about like 20 rupees. So it has not been arbitrarily done, but certainly from 3 rupees, it has gone up to whatever it is today. I can't remember. It was a significant increase. But the electricity charge was so low. I mean, these very poor households were spending a lot more on other items than an essential item like electricity. Now, they also had to revise water rates because it was totally infeasible. But again, they have a progressive system where the very low usage households get it at probably a subsidized price, although that price is significantly higher than what it used to be because costs have gone up and inflation has gone up. Then you come to the case of fuel, that there was a situation. Now you take, in the case of India, at the retail price level, I believe that the taxes are about 30 to 35%. In Sri Lanka, there was a time period where on diesel, we were only paying 5% tax of the retail price. The famous $500 million that India gave us as credit to buy fuel, at that point in time, I remember doing the maths that we sold fuel 40% cheaper than in India. And on a per capita basis, India's per capita is still lower than even Sri Lanka's current adjusted per capita GDP. So lots of these price-based subsidies that we previously had no rationale. It was never for the poor. It was for political reasons. It was ignorance. There was absolutely no reason why they didn't revise these prices. So this had to be done so that the impact had to be more on the richer households. And you must also, Sonali, understand the income distribution in Sri Lanka. The top 10% of households get 36, the top 20 get 51% of national income. The bottom 10% get 1.6, the bottom 20% get 4.6. So this income distribution has really not changed over many decades, but still all this adjustment has to be imposed on the richer households. So in all fairness to the government, all these price-based adjustments, really the burden is going to the top 50% of households. Now, this Aswasuma, which is a cash-based transfer, has also been critiqued by quite a few of the people working on this, that there are some design issues and that it was rushed through, etc. Now, I'm hoping that whatever issues there are with the program will in time be fixed, because such a complicated program cannot be done right the first time around. And there are also issues of the political economy. So you find there's a lot of resistance coming because there was, I believe, about 300,000 people who are excluded. And the criticism has been that there's a lot of people who are in the previous program who should never have been. There were inclusive errors in that, and that they should have been excluded. So the political economy is playing out. So my sense is that most of this adjustment basically is trying to target the richer households, because even the much criticized income tax, personal income tax, up to 150,000 rupees a month, you are exempted. 1.8 million a year. So most of the people paying the taxes are probably in the top 10% of households. And the criticism is that some of the bands are too narrow, that every 500,000 rupees, the rate jumps by 6%. Maybe there is some merit in that and some adjustment may be warranted, especially because of the high inflation. But this adjustment needed to be done. And if there is a vulnerable population out there, I would vehemently say that we have to refine this cash-based transfer and make sure that it goes directly to their bank account, and kind of take a leaf out of India's book about the India stack and the digitization. We are only partially done, so that the benefit flows directly to the people who really need it, and to allow the market system to operate based on prices. Because the key reason, in my opinion, why we got ourselves into this mess is that we tried to intervene in the market mechanism, didn't allow prices to reflect what it should be. And therefore, people like myself, who probably are representing the 0.1% of the top households in Sri Lanka, benefited more than many other people in the bottom 50%, because you were selling me electricity too cheap, you were selling me petrol too cheap, you were selling me cooking gas too cheap, you were selling me diesel too cheap, and my level of consumption is going to be significantly higher than many other households in Sri Lanka. So what is the benefit of giving me subsidies when I can jolly well pay for it?
Dr. Shamini Kure, the Deputy Managing Director of the IMF recently said that the current economic crisis of Sri Lanka has its genesis in policy missteps aggravated by external shocks. Plunder at the hands of Sri Lanka's politicians has deprived Sri Lankans of their rights. What measures must Sri Lankans take to ensure that history doesn't repeat itself? And I'd like you to focus on the policy aspect, the legal aspect, and also the educational aspect, if you could.
It's a fundamental question, and I think a very difficult one. I personally believe, although I'm not a political scientist, that unless you change the electoral system, we will perpetuate this system. Our democracy is no longer as representative as it should be. The parties have too much hold on who represents the people because of the list system, the nominations that, so most of the MPs, people hardly know who their MP is, and the MP hardly knows who their people are. So the parties, it's designed to give parties, established parties, maximum control. And therefore, they're more accountable to their donors than they are donors to run elections than they are to the people that they're supposed to represent. That's a fundamental problem. So to me, it's not an economic question, it's a political question. People have to ask for the electoral reforms so that the members of parliament are genuinely representative of the population's wishes. So I think let me take the legal one first. We need more prosecutions on corruption. I mean, it's amazing. Nobody goes to jail that I know of because of prosecution. There's no, the Attorney General is by design conflicted because I'm not talking about present people, by the way. I'm talking about the office of the Attorney General. They're supposed to represent government officials, but at the same time, they're supposed to prosecute. And it doesn't work that way. We need an independent prosecutor and an independent system to investigate corruption. I mean, right now in the United States, there's a sitting senator who has been charged, and he was charged before, and there was a mistrial, and so now he has been charged again on corruption. When is the last time anyone in Sri Lanka went at that kind of level? Got sent to jail. So we need to get this. So that the legal aspect is to me, independent prosecutor's office is one way to deal with it. By the way, there is a civil society governance diagnostic report that has come out. It has some good suggestions. I think this is one of the ways in which, to improve governance. I encourage people to read it. I had a look through it. I'm not saying every recommendation is good, but I think it makes some, at least sounded to me, very good recommendations, including a stronger prosecutorial frameworks to protect against corruption. The educational aspects, yes, we have to educate people, and there has to be transparency. I think transparency is critical. I mean, before you see, and Verity has put out some recent work to show that our public financial corporations and public entities that are supposed to publish proactively do not do so. Only a small fraction of them, I think about a third, do that. Only not even half are publishing their audited financial statements, which is shocking. So there is a lot to do in terms of public transparency. Based on that, there can be a lot more public education. I think people have to be very alert and really take an interest. I think an alert and responsive population and civil society has a big role to play in the educational aspects. And I think that is another way in which you can hold at least create well-informed citizen sort of pushback. I think the governance diagnostic is an example of something that was done in a constructive way. I don't think, I mean, the problem I have, I think sometimes is that people they protest because, yes, emotionally they are upset, but they are not always very well informed. So I think creating some communication between the independent entities that are think tanks and kind of having informed critiques and also solutions, most importantly, that the public can share and the public can use would be important. And media has a big role to play in this. Media, I find in Sri Lanka, is really not doing a good job of, they report things, but they don't do any investigation. They don't do any analysis. There are opinions being written, but the journalists themselves do very little. So I think the whole culture has to be changed so that we hold our leaders to be accountable in real time, not 5 years later, and even then we don't hold them accountable. So these are some of my thoughts on this, but it's a difficult question.
All right, thank you very much. Professor Ghosh, I'd like to hear your perspectives on the intersectionality between governance and law. In Sri Lanka, we find that certain laws are being weaponized against those who express a dissent against the government. For example, the anti-terrorism draft bill, the online safety draft bill, the Regulatory Broadcast Authority draft bill, the ICCPR Act. These are only a few of the statutes and draft legislation that's in the pipeline, which the government has tried to bring in or tried to use to stifle dissent. How dangerous is this for democracy, and how do you think Sri Lankans can better educate themselves to fight against or take a stand against such corrupt practices?
Yes, I mean, this is a very unfortunately relevant question. As an Indian, I'm only too aware of how the law can be weaponized against dissenters and has been weaponized over the past few years. So it is a great concern. It is something clearly that civil society has to mobilize against. It's also very sad for all of us who have been watching Sri Lanka with much sympathy from a distance because, I mean, your Aragalaya, your peaceful movement was an inspiration to so many people around the world. And for that to have then culminated in what are becoming attacks against people and democracy is very, very sad to see. But it's not just the obvious laws like the ones that you mentioned, which suppress dissent. Frankly, I believe, Mr. Jafferji, I was not aware of the law that you mentioned about the hard limits to monetary financing. To me, that's deeply anti-democratic as well. They tried to pass that once in the United States. There was such a strong reaction that they actually immediately stopped. In fact, they don't even have a law about an independent central bank, simply because of the political response, because of the recognition that macro policies are inherently political, that they do reflect different interests. Both monetary and fiscal policies are deeply distributional, deeply political, as Sharmini has been outlining. And in that context, I think it's important to remember that, Sharmini, you said, but you'd like to know what the alternatives are. You mentioned so many of these alternatives yourself. You have talked in detail about the different ways in which you can raise tax revenues in a progressive way, in the different ways in which you can reduce the illicit financial flows that are really such a drain on your foreign exchange reserves as well. These are all possible. And these would actually generate more than 3% of your import bill if you really did go out there and implement them properly. So I'm really thinking that, it's clear that there is a desire for doing things differently, and yet there isn't enough, let's say, political heft, or perhaps there is on the ground, but it hasn't yet translated into a massive movement that would force change at the top. But certainly among the elites, it's very clear that there is no appetite for change, that there is much more appetite for not just business as usual, but perhaps even worse than usual, because of the fact that you're getting disproportionate adjustment on those who are less able to bear it. I also want to completely agree with Mr. Jafferji about the need for differential pricing of utilities. I think that's an absolutely necessary and standard process in many parts of the world. But I would also argue that in a period of economic crisis, when there is a livelihood collapse, you don't raise the bottom rates. You actually keep the bottom rates low and, in fact, at zero, which many countries have done. And then you expand. You have much, much higher rates for the rich, as you have correctly argued. So I think differential pricing of utilities is essential. It's also important to remember that the prices of food and fuel affect all the other prices, but particularly fuel also affects transport prices, which in turn affects public transport and of the informal transport that many poor people are forced to take in all the major cities. And so you have to bear those considerations in mind as well. It's not just enough to have a limited and, as you mentioned, slightly problematic allocation of cash transfers to compensate. It's sometimes better to stop these problems at source through a system of differential pricing, which can be relatively easily implemented. I mean, many examples now across the world of differential pricing of both utilities and transport.
Mr. Jafferji, speak to us about how important it is to have informed conversations around areas of national importance in a bid to drive decision making that is scientific, inclusive, equitable, and also aligned with principles of dignity in terms of policy making, but also in terms of the citizenry knowing that what is being done is in their best interests.
Okay, that's a very pertinent question, Sonali, that you are asking to me, because I have strong opinions on this. Right now, one of in my introduction, you said that I'm part of a think tank, which is called Advocata, and the word Advocata came from advocate. So we found that there was a lot of ignorance, especially on economic issues amongst the population. So for us to have this kind of really vibrant democracy and highly accountable state, my belief is that you need to have a very well-informed and educated citizenry who understands key issues that impact their well-being. So one of the failures of our education system is that, for example, are familiar O-level, that most of the children in Sri Lanka go up to class 10. There is no formal education in economics. We have something called business studies and accounts. I think the time has come that after an unmitigated financial crisis, that we have at least some formal education in basic economics so that they understand the basics of a market economy. The second is that there is no civics education. So I have a straw poll in many audiences that I speak to. And I asked the leading question, how many people in this audience has read the Constitution of Sri Lanka? And most of these audiences are probably representative of the top 1% of professionals or business people or educated people. Except for the lawyers, very few other non-lawyers raise their hands. So your foundational law basically that defines your rights, most people have not even read, and they will have strong opinions about human rights, etc. They haven't even read the United Nations thing on human rights. So one of the things is to have a more informed electorate and a population, that the media has a large role to play in educating and informing and framing policy choices. Unfortunately, even the media institutions are fully captured, that we have a highly politicized media. We don't really have, there is a state broadcaster, but the state broadcaster has always been a tool of the ruling power. And over the years, because of the amount of neglect and mismanagement, the state broadcaster is also in a very weak financial situation. They have lost their market share. So their reach also is now a lot less than what it used to be. So we have a fundamental problem that how do you get your population well informed, energized, framing the debate? Because the other alternate, certainly in the younger population, is social media, which is also more easily manipulatable. So there is a lot of fake and false information out there that can do more damage, although the reach is significantly higher and it's a lot easier to make a reach. So if Sri Lanka is ever going to come out of this crisis, I do agree with Shamini with some of the things she said about corruption, but I would frame it this way, that we don't have inclusive political institutions. We have extractive political institutions. You have absolutist power. And unfortunately, we have created an executive presidency that has enormous amount of executive power with relatively low level of accountability and the checks and balances in dividing the three arms of government, the legislature, the judiciary, which are much weaker than the executive, has led to a very, very powerful executive presidency. And if you have the wrong person in that seat, basically, which has happened to us over many years, they can wreak havoc on our country. And I think there has to be a serious discussion in this country whether this form of political arrangement is best suited for us. The second is the issue of the electoral system, because you need too much of money to be in politics. We need small electorates, not district size electorates. And you start competing with your own people because you have a manapa system. You don't have a system of primaries because the leader of the party decides who will come on the party list. And we don't have an independent civil service in Sri Lanka, because as per Article 50.1 and 50.2 of the Constitution, it says that the secretaries will act, the president will appoint them, and 50.2 says that they will act under the direction and control of the minister. Prior to 1972's Constitution, there used to be an independent public service commission that used to appoint the secretaries, and they basically only implemented policies set by the politicians. The politicians couldn't direct and control them. So you have so many parts of a whole political system, the nature of the state, that also needs a serious rethink, because at the moment the focus is on economic restructuring and economic stabilization and changing, moving towards a more market-based system pricing. But I haven't seen much of a discussion on political reform. And what got us into this mess was a broken political system. And I think that this has to be energized at a very higher level, because the only way that we can, get a new path to a different outcome is to completely re-engineer the political system, because economic governance will come from the political system. See, under this highly extractive political system, it has led to extractive economic institutions. So state-owned enterprises are economic extractive institutions. I am in the state-owned enterprise restructuring unit as a volunteer, and I see firsthand the kind of things that have been happening, and it's unbelievable. It's a tragedy. And there are those who argue that no, the state should continue to hold this. The only reason that the state should continue to hold this is if it's going to continue to be a source of economic extraction. There is no rational reason, except for very few examples like network industries that may need to have a different kind of model. There is no justification for the state to continue to hold these state-owned enterprises, which are commercial enterprises best left to the market system. So there are many other things, Sonali, that we need to fix in this country. But the thing that I am going to work on is to try to better educate the population, because we have a huge problem of an ignorant population. Yeah. And our focus is to try to educate young people that at least, they probably have access to more social media, etc. And they are open to an alternate way of thinking.
All right. Thank you very much for your closing remarks. Professor Jayati Ghosh, I'd like to come to you for your closing remarks. As we can't go back in time and need to accept things as they are, as at right now, how must the macroeconomic and policy environment of Sri Lanka be salvaged?
This is a very big question, but I think, yes, it's very clear that I have been emphasizing the distributional aspects of economic policies, and particularly the fiscal and now increasingly the monetary and debt policies. And I think that has to be taken into consideration much more than it has been. In other words, as far as possible, the adverse distributional consequences, the impact on the bottom half of the population has to be reduced, mitigated, ideally completely eliminated. And the burden has to be borne by the elites and by those who benefited from the previous regime. And there are many ways in which this can be done, and we've talked about several of these already. I just want to also emphasize that, I'm no one to comment on the politics of Sri Lanka, and I think both of you have already made very important points. But in general, we know that both states and markets can be subject to elite capture. This is well known across the world. So it's not just about corrupt states, it's about the ability of large players also to influence market behavior. The idea that there's a simple dichotomy that we move to a market-determined system and it will all be okay, I think is misplaced. We really need a democratization of both and accountability of both. And that requires, yes, absolutely, it requires very different politics. And all I can say is that, from outside Sri Lanka, there are so many people in South Asia and across the world who are looking to you, because we really did find the Aragalaya a very inspiring moment in Sri Lankan history, the ability of a peaceful mass movement to actually apparently overthrow a corrupt regime. And we find the subsequent trajectory depressing, yes. So I think, we're all rooting for you very much, and we're really hoping that Sri Lanka does live up to the promises of the Aragalaya, and that those in charge and those who are able to get leadership do respond to the needs of the people and to the voice of the people much more than they have done in the past few years.
Thank you, Professor Ghosh. And finally, Dr. Shamini Kure, I hope we can end this conversation on a positive note. There is lots of good work being done. There are brilliant experts who have and who are weighing in on the multiple crises that Sri Lanka is facing at the moment, yourself included. Are you hopeful that we can usher in Sri Lanka's economic recovery in an equitable and holistic manner eventually?
Yes, I am hopeful. I'm hopeful because Sri Lanka has had many shocks and difficulties in the past and has come out of it one way or the other and made significant progress in terms of, let's not forget, our per capita income increased very consistently over time for many years and put us in at the cusp of being a upper middle income country before the crisis. Now, some of this was a bit froth on too much optics and not necessarily substantive. But what my bottom line is, we are resilient and we'll do it again. However, it's not a given. It's up to us. And absolutely, all the things that Murtaza was saying about, people have to hold their leaders accountable. And we have to have the systems and people ultimately, are responsible for how they're governed. And we're a democracy, and so we have to do this, and I'm confident we will. And I think we have an educated workforce. Let's not forget the pluses. We have an educated workforce, relatively speaking. We have an excellent private sector. It has to be given more space to be able to drive growth. The state is no longer in a position to be able to do that. So I think we can. And I want to also say, having strong institutions embedded in legislation is an important part of the getting out of this. And the central bank independence is pretty key to this. And Jayati is not here, so maybe it's unfair for me to say that, but I do not agree that the Federal Reserve is not independent. It is one of the most independent central banks you can find. Even though its statute is from 1913, Congress gave it a lot of independence to take its decisions without congressional approval or anybody, the Federal Reserve, and anybody who lived through the 80s knows that Volcker raised those interest rates and crushed inflation, and it was not politically popular. So successful central banks are independent. They are accountable to Parliament, which our central bank bill does make the central bank accountable to Parliament and to elected representatives. So I just want to be clear that part of this has to be us building strong institutions embedded in legislation, and also being vigilant. Vigilance is the price of having to, having a strong polity and having a strong economy. So I would say, yes, I am optimistic. We can do this. And our priority is to get the growth going in a sustainable, inclusive way. And we outlined some of the things that can be done. And we need to press the policymakers to do so. And we will get out of this that way.
Thank you very much for an absolutely stimulating, thought-provoking discussion. Dr. Shamini Kure, Professor Jayati Ghosh, and Mr. Murtaza Jafferji, thank you for sharing your perspectives and your expertise. We'll see you again soon.